Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar, and I'm Deputy Director of the South Asia Centre here at the London School of Economics. I'm delighted to welcome all of you here this afternoon for the second event in our termly events weekly. And this afternoon, we are going to discuss a very, very recently published book by LSE faculty, Naila Kabeer, which is titled Renegotiating Patriarchy, Gender, Agency, and the Bangladesh Paradox, which was published by LSE Press in September 2024. And this is the first in our Fact and Fiction series at the South Asia Centre, where we discuss one particular recently published book and invite a panel of experts to talk about it. I'm not going to say anything about the book. I normally say a bit by way of introduction at the event because we have the author with us who's going to speak about the book shortly. But before that, I'd first like to thank LSE Press, with whom we are doing this event in collaboration and who have made copies of the book available to everyone. As I speak, the link to the book is just being pasted into the chat box of the live stream, which you can see. It's open access book. Please do download it from there if you would like to have a copy of the book. A very warm welcome to all of you who are joining us from different parts of the world, as far away as California and Japan, literally the expanse of the globe. And we're very delighted to have you here with us. The event is happening via Zoom. You're watching it on YouTube. And the chat box is enabled so that you can ask questions if you would like to. Viewers should know that they are welcome to pose questions to individual speakers or to the entire panel. And I will pose those questions at regular intervals to the panel once the initial comments have been made and the discussion gets underway. Also, please note that if you would like to tweet, then the Twitter handles of the various speakers are given in the description in front of you, as is that of the South Asia Centre, which is given against my name. I should add over here that had this event been happening on site at LSE, attendees at LSE public events have the right to ask questions to speakers without revealing their identity. In keeping with that spirit, when I ask questions from YouTube, I will not be mentioning your names, so you are free to ask the questions as you wish. It is now my very pleasant task to introduce the speakers as well as the author for today's event. We had a brief chat earlier to decide the order in which the speakers will speak, and the order in which I introduced them now is the order in which they will speak. The way we will do this is that I will first invite the author to make a presentation about the book, after which the three speakers will make initial remarks, after which the author will have the chance to respond, and then we will have the discussion. Once again, you're very welcome to ask questions, and please ask them via the chat box. The author and the first speaker today is Naila Kabeer. Naila is Professor of Gender and Development at LSE, Faculty Associate at LSE International Inequalities Institute, and currently Richard von Weiszäcker Fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin, and is the author of the book being discussed this afternoon, Renegotiating Patriarchy, Gender, Agency, and the Bangladesh Paradox. Our first speaker, after Naila has spoken, is Dr. Sajeda Amin, who is an independent researcher with research interests in gender, work, poverty, and family in the developing world. Until recently, she was Senior Associate for the Poverty, Gender, and Youth Program at the Population Council in New York. Dr. Urvashi Butalia is an author, founder of Zubaan Books, India's premier feminist publishing house, reader at the College of Vocational Studies, the University of Delhi, and visiting fellow at the Young India program at Ashoka University in India. Dr. Aisha Khan is Senior Research Fellow in Gender Inequality and Social Inclusion at the Overseas Development Institute here in London, and is the author of Women's Movement in Pakistan, Activism, Islam and Democracy, which was published in 2018. The discussant this afternoon is Hilary Standing, who is Professor and Emeritus Fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, the University of Sussex, an expert on gender and equity of health systems, and has studied and published extensively on Bangladesh. Everyone, welcome to this afternoon's program. I'm now going to invite Naila to speak first and introduce her brand new book. Naila, please speak now. You have about 10 minutes.
Thank you, Nilanjan, and I'm very grateful that the South Asia Centre is having this launch. This book has taken longer to write than I had expected, partly because it kind of got bigger and bigger and bigger. Because in a way, it's a very classic academic endeavor. There was something that caught my attention, something that I wanted to explain and understand. In the larger terms, it was called the Bangladesh paradox. And it was expressing surprise that Bangladesh, that as we all know was known as an international basket case when it became independent, it was a very, very poor country, second poorest, I think, after Rwanda or Ethiopia, which, depending on which report you read. It had high rates of fertility, invoked, scenarios, Malthusian scenarios of disaster, famine. It had, for several years after independence, military rule, assassinations. Its quality of governance looks very poor. And yet it managed to achieve, within a decade and a half after its independence, some extraordinary outcomes. The first that was surprising was that fertility rates started to go down. This was unexpected because people felt like, peasant irrationality meant that fertility rates would stay high forever, no matter what. Then you started to see other changes. Infant survival. Children started surviving longer. Their health improved, their nutrition improved. But in all of this, what was also interesting is that the gender gaps in these indicators, health, nutrition, child survival, maternal mortality, these gaps started to also improve. So something was happening in a country that had been described as one of a very extreme form of patriarchy. And people had all kinds of explanations about them, all of which are valid. This is not the achievement of any one political party or any one government. These changes have occurred over a period of time, and different governments have contributed to them. It was not the donors, though the donors with their interest in gender equality probably played some kind of a role. But I think what really caught my attention and made me want to write this book was the fact that I had done my PhD fieldwork in a village in Bangladesh in 1979, when it embodied all these very negative characteristics, including not just high rates of fertility, but strong son preference. Sometime in the 1990s, we started to see that girls were beginning to survive, as they do in the rest of the world, longer than boys, and that parents were expressing a sort of change in the strong son preference that they had expressed before. They're expressing an appreciation of daughters. And Urvashi will know this well, that in neighboring India, which was also having, fertility decline, it was accompanied by sex-selective abortion, so that many more boys were born than girls. This was not happening in Bangladesh. So it was this puzzle, this paradox that I wanted to explain. And I also wanted to add to this the fact that since military rule in Bangladesh in the mid-70s, we have seen a weakening of the commitment to secularism that we began out with, and rising tide of Islamic orthodoxy, fueled as it is across the world by the Middle East money, but also by migrants coming back from the Gulf. So in spite of this rising tide of Islamic orthodoxy, and of course Islam is often held to be antithetical to women's rights, we still continue to see this progress on gender equality. So this book is about the Bangladesh paradox, but it tells a story that has been told in different ways, but from the perspective of the men and women who made that paradox happen, who drove that change. And so it begins with trying to understand what led to this very rapid fertility decline in a country that has such apparently intransigent fertility rates. And in exploring what is an often told story, I once again relied on qualitative data. What were people saying? And what becomes very clear is the people who drove fertility decline, the people who embraced family planning, often in the face of opposition from family, community, and husbands, were women, very often quite poor women. And so that rapid fertility decline defied demographic transition theory, which expects, women's status to improve, education to improve, etc., etc. In Bangladesh, it happened in the reverse way. Fertility decline allowed education to improve. Parents could now afford to send children to school. The other things that were happening was we were a very poor country, and the affordability of a male breadwinner was, questioned. And we had NGOs that targeted women for microfinance. We had factories that didn't necessarily look for female labor, but that women responded to. And in all of this, what we're seeing is through the actions of other players, the possibilities available to women in Bangladesh, both poor and not so poor, began to expand. And our governments at that time, whatever else they did, were talking the language of gender equality. And so I was very struck by the fact that sometime in the 1990s, I saw a father and he sending his daughter to school. And I said, this is interesting. Girls didn't used to go to school before. And he said, my daughter has rights too. So where did that language about rights come from at the grassroots level? It came from the rhetoric, the discourse. But people heard it and interpreted it in ways that made sense to them. So I think what this book is doing is it's tracing all the different changes that happened, particularly in terms of gender equality, and trying to understand the mechanisms of change. What is it that makes change happen? And I think what I found very interesting by the end is that what makes change happen at the individual level is a social thing. So when we talk about things like role models, when we talk about things like feedback effects or, tipping points, what's going on is that people are observing the world around them. And where they see change happening, that change is expanding the capacity to aspire, their capacity to imagine their own lives differently. And so one of the things I did, so the book covers, it looks at reproductive rights, it looks at family planning, it looks at education, it looks at labor force participation. And once again, the contrast with India is that female labor force participation in Bangladesh went up and up and up, whereas it's been going down and down and down in India. Though I have to point out, a lot of the female labor force participation is in home-based income generation. It's not like that people are going out to work. So it looks at all of and each of these changes, the ability to control your fertility, the ability to send your daughters to school, each of them carried within them, the seeds of future change. And work itself, all the stuff that economists talk about in terms of bargaining theory and all of that comes true. If you are no longer completely dependent on the male breadwinner, if you too are contributing to the household and seem to be contributing, people cannot treat you as they have done in the past. So quite a lot of this, when I call it renegotiating patriarchy, this was not open confrontation. These women weren't out to overthrow patriarchy. There is a great deal about their own culture that they hold on to, but a great deal that they want to change. And I think the most moving part of this whole story is the way that both fathers and mothers began to appreciate their daughters more. So there's a chapter in the book that tries to explain the move from strong son preference, not to daughter preference, but to a much weaker son preference, a more egalitarian set of attitudes. And it tries to explain why that happened. Because that is, in a sense, at the heart of the book. What has explained this shift away from very strong son preference to a willingness to educate your daughter, to make sure she gets married somewhere where she will be happy, and so on. So I think the other thing that I guess the book does is it is it sort of takes issue with the models of development and change that we have been trying to operate with. Bangladesh paradox is only a paradox because it did not conform to demographic transition theory, to modernization theory, and to economic growth theory. What it did was a peculiarly Bangladesh story of change. It took the history that it had, the geography that it inherited, it took the culture, and it's a Muslim majority country, but with a fairly relaxed view of Islam, one that accommodates many different kinds of belief systems. It took all those and used them to carve out a pathway of change for ordinary people in Bangladesh. So it is, I think, a heartening story, because it is about how people can exercise agency even in the face of what appeared to be immutable structures. So in a sense, the book is in two parts. One is, why were people so pessimistic about change in Bangladesh in the 70s? Why did the structures of patriarchy and class and so on look so intransigent? Why did fertility behavior look like it was never going to change, Malthus or not? So that was one part of the story. And the other part of the story is, well, why did it change? And how was it that very ordinary poor people were able to reimagine their futures and make things happen to try and realize that future? So I hope all of you who I know have read it share in my belief that this is a remarkable story, a very interesting story. So I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Naila. I did, while introducing, I made a mistake. My apologies. We had decided Urvashi was going to speak first, but I introduced Sajeda first. So, Urvashi, are you fine with going first still, or?
Yes, I'm fine either way.
Great. So let me just introduce you once again. We've had quite a few people join us in the last few minutes. Dr. Urvashi Butalia is an author, is founder of Zubaan Books, which is India's premier feminist publishing house, is reader at the College of Vocational Studies at the University of Delhi, and visiting fellow at the Young India program at Ashoka University in India. Urvashi, please speak now. You have 6 to 8 minutes.
Thanks, Nilanjan. I'm actually visiting faculty at Ashoka. Little bit old for me to be a fellow, but I wouldn't mind, actually. Be nice. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Naila, for doing this book. I'm delighted to be with all of you. And I have, there's a lot to say about this book, but I will make just 3 or 4 points to me which are very important. One, it seems actually wrong to use the word timely for a book like this, given the turbulence that is going on in the country that the book is about. But I think in many ways it is a timely book because it points to the limits of the possible, or if you like, not the limits of the possible, but what can be achieved, how you can actually see change. And in that sense, it offers kind of hope for the future. So I was particularly pleased to read it at this time. The other thing that I actually wanted to say was that, Naila, when I started reading the book, I was at the same time reading a manuscript that had been offered to us. And, as publishers do, we often read several things at the same time. The manuscript was a collection of stories written by young girls who are not very much younger than many of the women you talk about in your book. They're all poor girls from Muslim families, largely in North India. And what they were writing about in their own words were stories about how they managed to convince their families to let them have an education, and how basically their deep desire to study and to go out to school was achieved through a process of negotiation in the nooks and crannies of their families where they found agency, and how both fathers and mothers actually eventually supported them. And to me, that book, when I was reading it and I was reading yours, it was like a mirror image to see this, look at this whole question of women's agency and the fact of, what you said when you introduced the book, that it's not like you're fighting to change the world, but you know that this one step is possible for you. And if you can take that, and if you can convince the people around you, then other steps will open up in due course. So it's a kind of limited one step at a time thing, which is not, I don't think, particularly thought out as a strategy, but it's just something that unfolds as you go on. So I was very struck by that, and that to me seemed a very important point. The other thing that struck me in trying to understand the paradox that you address in the book is that the ways in which you take a long view, meshing history with geography, with economics, with some ethnography, with all kinds of disciplines. And you know, this is the first time that I have, for example, seen something that talks about how Islam came to this region, which was so far away from other regions, how the geographical formations of the delta influenced the paths that it took, and so many other things. So that long view was for me very important in understanding the change that you were trying to point to. Within that, actually, the other thing that was really significant was the ways in which the individual story. So you spoke of a father who said what he said. The individual story is never lost sight of. And, you know, in many ways, unless in academic work, unless you have a substantial sample to prove something, the anecdotal stuff is dismissed as being of less value. But here, when you read anecdote upon anecdote of women talking about their lives, the cumulative impact of that, when combined with the historical view that you take, becomes very apparent. And to me, what was really striking was that no matter what you were talking about, whether it was the class structure, whether it was religion and fundamentalism, whether it was a geographical spread, whether it was fertility rates, whether it was the violence that women face, you never lost sight of the voice of the woman. You talked of the voice of families and fathers, but I was really struck by the fact that the women's voice was never completely lost sight of. It was always there. Okay, then one of the other things that also struck me was the fact that you address the change that was brought about by NGOs. And I think that's very particular in Bangladesh, because, of course, all across our region, we have seen NGOs, and particularly NGOs that work with women, are doing some amazing work on the ground. But the fear that our states have of NGOs being a force that is, I mean, the ways in which NGOs are infantilized by the state that thinks that they are easy prey for the foreign hand, whereas the presence of the foreign hand is much more apparent in what states do than it is in what civil society and NGOs do. So despite all the complications and the sort of bitterness that's addressed to NGOs, you talked about the ways in which NGOs had made a difference, and the combination of not only the huge NGOs in Bangladesh, but also the smaller ones like Nijera Kori, like Proshika, like Nari Pokho, and so many others who have worked with a kind of commitment. So that recognizes the multi-layeredness of the ways in which change kind of unfolds. And I have one last point to make, which is just this, that I was, of course, struck, as anyone would be, and you point that out in the beginning of your book as well, about how different the situation is in the neighboring countries, and really how different it is in India, where the labor force participation rate of women has been so drastically falling, and nobody's been able to figure out exactly why. And one of the hypotheses that is being put forward is that because women are getting more educated, they're kind of dropping out of work. But men have got educated forever and they haven't dropped out of work. So I don't see why women should drop out of work. But it just made me think that perhaps it's the size of the country, but something that takes this kind of long historical view and tries to understand what is going on in India would be a very interesting exercise, but a pretty impossible one, I think. So perhaps we can borrow from your framework and try to look at it in smaller terms and see where we are going. But that is the paradox in India that actually so far we haven't found an explanation for. What is happening to labor force participation? Because everywhere around you, you see women are only ever working. It's the men who are hanging out, drinking chai and drinking daru and so on. You never see a woman hanging about doing nothing. It's an unusual sight. So what is happening? What's the mystery? And I actually don't understand it. So maybe we'll find some clues to this in work like yours. I'll stop there, but thank you for writing it. I really found it fascinating to read. You called it a deeply academic book. I found it an extremely accessible book. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Urvashi. And my apologies, and I must correct myself, that Urvashi is visiting faculty at Ashoka University in India. I had said visiting fellow. My apologies, the mistake was mine. Our next speaker is Dr. Sajeda Amin, who is an independent researcher with research interests in gender, work, poverty, and family in the developing world. Until recently, Sajeda was Senior Associate for the Poverty, Gender, and Youth Program at the Population Council in New York. Sajeda, please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Naila, for organizing this, and Naila for writing this book. I will pick up where Urvashi left off, which is to say it is really a pleasure to read. And I'm not afraid to recommend to my 18-year-old who will not read a book on Bangladesh otherwise, and I think I can convince her. So I want to pick up also from where Urvashi left off, which is on the description of the emphasis on women's voices and agency. And I want to pick up on a theme that's throughout the book, but resonates with me in particular, which is this whole idea of how the habitus that women live in is changing. And it's changing, and what you talk about amounts to the fact that it's changing because of women's roles changing in their community. And women, individual women, experience that transformation in the community. It relates to the macro processes that you talk about, in the sense that I think if you look at the history of the family planning sector, the education sector, all of the changes that you talk about, garment work, there was a recognition in the programs, among policymakers, that it was important for women to be in the front lines, that you could not achieve what you wanted to achieve without women being in the front line. So that connection to me is really important in terms of kind of a policy prescription of what you need to be cognizant of in macro discussions. Now that we've had this paradox and we've recognized there are all these positive transformations taking place, there is a tendency to go on talking about macro processes, capital markets, etc., as though those particularities don't matter anymore. So I think making that connection with women in the front line and that recognition in the policy realm is really important. And this women in the front line, because there was a recognition from government, from NGOs, it's actually not a small thing. So I was just doing some numbers. There are now several million school teachers who are women. And they started in kind of in this big burst when the education policy happened in the 70s. They recruited large numbers of young women to work in primary schools. Similarly, health workers had to be women, was a very early realization, because of the success of family planning workers who were so successful in entering the homes and reaching women and reaching children through the women. So I think this realization that there was this divide, in the words of Amartya Sen and Bangla literature, between the home and the world, the reference to Tagore, and that the recognition in the policy realm, in the program realm, that you had to refigure that in order for some of these transformations to happen. So I think that really comes through in your description of role models, in your description of the habitus changing, as well as the concept behind role models, which is that really the ultimate transformation for women was, or for the poor, was this change in the ability to aspire. And I think Appadurai and others who have talked about this notion of poverty being the failure to aspire is central. Where it's central is the ability to observe change agents and the ability to observe people around them who are behaving differently. So it's this, what's change that's happening in the community that's important. The second point I want to make is about the problem we have with the labor force participation. Women participate in bigger numbers, but not with many hours of work. It's very part-time work. I've found, I didn't pick it up if you mentioned it, I found very compelling Jeff Wood and Sattar Mondal's work on transformations in the peasant economy, and in particular, the rise of rentier and contractual relationships. And in a particular seminar that I attended where they were presenting their work, they give the example of the wife of a remittance work earner managing the homestead, managing the farm by contracting out and by using these mechanisms. The point being that, again, sort of women being in the home are now able to do very different things and all the things that men did. And that transformation in the agricultural sector has been central to that story. So again, kind of this perspective that a lot of the big changes have happened because interventions, programs, policies have kind of broken the barriers between the home and the world. As a demographer, I suppose I must say something about the numbers, which I'm really glad you relegated to an appendix, so we didn't have to wade through it. I found the overall macro trends compelling, even the comparisons with India and Pakistan. So life expectancy, infant mortality, fertility, etc. I didn't think the numbers on sex ratios at birth, which have, and this is not about the qualitative evidence to be present, but the numbers were necessarily compelling. And I think I know why. I think it's because this whole phenomena of missing women, the excess of that everyone wrote about, John Bongart's, Amartya Sen, of course, etc. It didn't last long. It was kind of a time, as you know, it went away. It rose when for a time and then it went away. So I think kind of the numbers don't quite do justice to the words of the women that you use. So I think that for me was done just right in terms of being dealt for in the appendix. And finally, I don't know if you wrote this book before August 5th. So I'm very impressed by your last 2 pages and how you're spot on in predicting what might happen. I mean, the paradox doesn't have to remain a paradox. It can, it will have done its job. But we do have to watch out for the kinds of processes that are happening at the macro space and how that might go awry very easily. So I'll stop here, I think.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Ayesha Khan, who is Senior Research Fellow in Gender Equality and Social Inclusion at the Overseas Development Institute here in London. And Ayesha is author of Women's Movement in Pakistan, Activism, Islam and Democracy, which was published in 2018. Ayesha, please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nilanjan and the LSE South Asia Center for inviting me to be part of this panel today and reflect on Naila's wonderful book. I'm really honored to have the opportunity to share my thoughts. And speaking after both of you, Sajeda and Urvashi, I'm not sure what more I can add, but maybe I'd just give you a few brief comments on what struck me while I was reading the book with increasing enthusiasm and excitement. So one was that a comment on methods, maybe. What I loved most, I think, about the book was how the different sources of data were used creatively. As Naila mentions, drawing on an open-ended methodological approach allowed you to see data from different time periods bring mixed methods, longitudinal insights, and put it all together to build a history of incremental gains in gender that paints a much larger picture. And this picture is so carefully drawn through the use of this evidence. I felt as if it was putting into place years of careful data collection by a wide body of researchers, not just yourself, but a whole community of people, the interviews they'd done, the surveys, the studies. And when brought together, they tell us a profound story of how social change happens. So it's the method of how you did this that I think is really powerful and is a major contribution of the book. But most of all, of course, as a qualitative researcher myself, I was drawn to the attention that you paid to telling the stories of women and wonderfully allowing us to hear their own voices throughout the text, because it showed us how ordinary women constantly navigated patriarchy as they sought to improve their own lives and those of their children. And that is the deeper drive that I see coming out from the qualitative data, is that over and over again, they're doing this aspiration, maybe as Sajeda, you mentioned, from seeing the role models, but seeing where change is happening and then aspiring for that in their own lives. And I found that really moving. And their words provide us with the deepest insights of all, I think, in the text about how agency is exercised. By reflecting on data gathered over long time periods, we are allowed to see how intergenerational change happens in both attitudes and practices. And in the narrative that you put together, Naila, you have been able to identify changes in the patriarchal bargain itself, something that we find so intransigent in South Asia and so hard. We grapple with it every day. So thank you for that. Of course, while reading the books, while reading the book, I could not help but constantly try to understand comparisons with the country where I have spent my career working, which is Pakistan. As you explained, Naila, of course, studying the processes of change in Bangladesh on its own terms, in its own right, rather than compared to some model of development, is certainly obviously merited. But what it means for comparison across South Asian countries is also really, I think, the next step of this conversation that it would be great to hear a bit more about today. And as I read the book, I found myself looking for clues to help explain Pakistan's own uneven record in human development, and for women especially. So while your book lays out the structural elements that contributed to the social change around gender roles and expectations, I saw how different they were from ours. After independence, Bangladesh became ruled by a domestic elite that you point out that was from the region, from local, not from outside the region for the first time. And that elite had a connectedness with the people across not only state institutions, but civil society and private sector, and dare I say, maybe military as well. But you also mentioned that Bangladesh has a unique population density and other forms of connectedness that bring its people together. So yes, it received extensive donor support, and yes, it had growing Arab influence, as you've commented on throughout the book, and that has shaped the opportunities discourse and habitus of the people. But there are some clear, and those features may be in common with Pakistan, but the other structural elements are not. And I think that divergence with Pakistan became clear to me as you laid that out. In Pakistan, we have fierce contestations within our elite, and we have deep disengagement with the wider population. And that is something that we need to maybe take more seriously as we consider our own, not paradox, but deepening dive into human lack of development. And whereas your book draws attention to the Islamist influence in Bangladesh, dare I say it is, of course, nowhere near as dramatic as in Pakistan. With us, political Islam is now so deeply integrated into the state and polity. The culture and practice of Islam has changed, probably irreversibly. And with it, it has further entrenched gender norms in ways that are reinforcing the patriarchal bargain. And in that sense, it might be instructive for some of the concerns that you're having now about where Bangladesh may go. But most importantly, I see the biggest divergence with Pakistan when it comes to state support for women. Because in Pakistan, the state was never fully behind girls' education. I felt envious when I read in your book about how the state provided fiscal support, stipends for girls to go to school, and trained women teachers with a kind of zealousness that we've never seen in Pakistan. In fact, in Pakistan, there's been a reluctance to bring women into the development project, be it training them as teachers or as health workers or as giving them employment opportunities. And that reluctance of the state, we are paying such a great price for it today. Reading your insights about the transformative education, of course, of these developments in education, for example, on marriage and dowry practices, made me realize in Pakistan, wherever we have brought women into education or used them as health workers, it has always been instrumentalist. And because of that instrumentalist relationship with women as workers, perhaps that is the reason why we have not seen the ongoing impact on changes in marital patterns, for example, or son preference. So I don't want to go on too long, but I just wanted to say that these are some of the questions that arose for me. And finally, back to methods, just to conclude, the focus on hearing women's voices allows us to see where change might be happening even where before larger patterns emerge. And I was wondering whether in Pakistan, maybe there are places or pockets in the country where we might, if we listen carefully enough, see that there might be ruptures. And I'm thinking here particularly around the ruptures created through political conflict in Balochistan or in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where openings are provided that might force a kind of rethinking of the patriarchal bargain. And I'm wondering whether we're paying enough attention in Pakistan in our scholarship or in our analysis of how human development plays out to those kinds of ruptures as indications of where change could go. So I think I'll stop there. I must have completed my time, but I didn't comment on son preference, but dare I say that we still struggle with that in Pakistan, even though the fertility rates are coming down, which is another kind of indication of how divergent our paths have been. So thank you again, Naila, for writing this book, and I look forward to reading it again and again in my work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aisha. Naila, I'm now going to invite you to respond briefly to the comments that have been made, and then we can start the discussion. I should mention to you, no pressure, we do have questions coming in. So if you could keep your responses brief so we have time to include the questions from members of the audience, whom I invite once again to ask questions via the chat box. Naila, please speak now, 5-7 minutes, yeah? Naila, you need to put on your microphone.
I want to say thank you to all of you for having obviously carefully read the book and obviously liked it. You know, there is nothing as deeply satisfying to someone who writes as to find readers who appreciate what they've done. And I'm very pleased that you all did pick up on the methodological attempts that I was making, because I was trained in quantitative. I've become very enamored of qualitative, but I still recognize the need very often to have statistics, you know, to give some sort of confidence or some idea of magnitudes. I'll just say a couple of things on Urvashi. You know, your stories about those young Muslim girls, I think speaks to what Aisha is talking about. You know, when some of these conversations were happening in the 80s, nobody saw these conversations as, prophesying what was to come. So people were talking about how, daughters seem to look after their parents better, but it seemed like a random comment, not the beginnings of something would swell into change. So I think that I found that very interesting for myself, you know, reading through this material from the 70s and 80s and picking up on things that later turned out to be the beginnings of change. The other thing I think both you and Aisha talked about, the comparisons with India and Pakistan. Pakistan, I've never found enough material for me to, engage, but I've always kind of kept an eye on India. And there was a point at which the final chapter almost became a story about India. and I was told this is not a story about India, and try and cut it down. What I found fascinating about India is that the change happened in the reverse. The progressive cultures of the South in India were overtaken by some of the more patriarchal attitudes of the North. So in India, the move went from, dowry went to South India, and marrying people at some distance outside your kinship. So and I think Al-Kabasu has commented on that. And I really think there is a very, very fascinating story to be told about India. And I think the big difference with Bangladesh is caste. The fact that we can marry in ways, and I've seen statistics that tell me that in parts of India, caste endogamy remains very strong. And on what Sajeda said, the fact that states, NGOs recognize the need, now it's passed into a policy language as intentionality. There is an intention to put gender equality in the forefront. I think at that time it was just recognized that women would reach other women. In a patriarchal society, you needed women to reach other women. But we also saw the price some of those early cohorts of women in the public domain had to pay, whether they were family planning workers, whether they were garment workers, whether they were working for the state. They got a lot of abuse, because they were the ones that were breaking with tradition. So that is also important to remember. And I think a government official said they were the stormtroopers. They paid the price of change, but because they were there in the public domain, others could come afterwards. The other interesting thing, and it's people who don't necessarily write about this, although Simin Mahmood, who I've worked with, is how often people make reference to the fact that actually having some income of your own empowers you. So it came about in a survey done by Simin, and it was for the Agriculture Sector Review. And they made the point that, women would say they don't work in the fields, but a lot of women were working if they were working with men in the fields. The presence of men from their families allowed them to work in the fields. And a kind of a throwaway comment in that report is these women who were very active in their farms also were much more active in decision-making within the household. And Sarah White, writing about her area in Rajai, makes these points. So it's there, but it's not made anything much of. And then you start to see how and why it made a difference. The other thing about role models, I think, is they were not intended as role models. People saw things around them. Those people became their role models, but they were not a policy constructed role model. They were seeing change and they were imagining change. And I just want to end by one of the things that has struck me and that I want to carry with me is the power of education. We take education so for granted. And yet I found in this book, and I have a footnote about half a page long, which uses statistical findings of what a difference education of women makes to what they can do for themselves and what they can do for their children. And I actually asked Pauline Rose, who does a lot of work, do you know how this works? And actually, people don't. They don't actually. They know it takes girls out of the home. They know it, and I, cite a few things. But there's something interesting about what happens when you have a decent education, when you get that education. So it's something that I think I want to stay with in the future.
Thank you very much, Naila. I'm sure we'll come back to some of these, if not a lot of these, later on. Hilary, as I mentioned just now, we have a couple of questions, but why don't we start and please start with making your own comments if you would like to, and then we'll get on to the discussion and I'll post the questions at some point. Hilary Standing, who is discussant for this afternoon's event, is Professor and Emeritus Fellow at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. He's an expert on gender and equity of health systems and has studied and published extensively on Bangladesh. Hilary, please speak now.
Thank you very much, Nilanjan. Yes, I managed to turn my microphone on. And thank you to you and to Naila and to the panelists. It's actually a great honour to be asked to do this, because I'm actually not much of an expert on Bangladesh. I've lived and worked there, but I wouldn't call myself an expert. But I have also the privilege of knowing Naila for probably more years than either of us can now calculate, from the very early days when I knew all about her fieldwork in Bangladesh. So really, I think my comments in some ways are going to be a bit repetitious of the comments from Urvashi and Sajeda and Aisha, because I think we're probably all finding very similar themes and inspirations from your book. So I will just briefly go over a couple of points that I think also point to the wider discussion. I mean, one's the conceptual point and the other is the methodological point. We have all picked up, I think, on the importance that you give to to women's agency in this book. What I think is particularly striking about your book conceptually is that although there's always been a very rich literature on women's political movements, on activism and protest against patriarchy and gender oppression and so on, I was thinking about your book in relation to the sort of mainstream gender and development literature over several decades, and thinking that it's been a bit of a one-way street in some ways. So a lot of it's been about what's been done to women or for women to improve their status, to empower them or to enable empowerment and so on. There's quite a lot of that kind of thinking in gender development. It's all good stuff. But it's been about how political or economic or social interventions act upon gender relations to change them, for better or worse, or leave them unchanged while the other transformations kind of happen around them. So I think it's still quite rare to find the political economy of transformation read from the other, also from the other perspective. And I think part of the originality of the way you've worked conceptually with this is that you've inverted that framing in some ways. So through the lens of kind of macroeconomic processes, such as changes in labour markets, the shift to universal education, ways of delivering healthcare, and so on, we get to see the changes also being driven by the microeconomic changes that I think all the panel have picked up on, the microeconomic and micro-social change. What is happening in families, in households, in communities, in women's minds, which also become powerful drivers of change. And it's very nice to see, I think a number of the panelists have mentioned, women being able to imagine a different future, women having aspirations. Urvashi, you talked about the women, the poor Muslim women who nevertheless were able to start negotiating with their families, and how important this kind of quotidian negotiation is, because it builds. It's not just what happens in the domestic sphere. It then has, it links up, it links to other families, to other communities and so on. And I think you show that so powerfully in your book, Naila, because of course you've got the background, you have been there, you have seen and you have collected so much information. So I think what you've got here is you've given us a two-way street. You've got a conceptual framing that doesn't pit agency against structure, but it understands agency as both shaped by and also powerfully shaping structure. And we see women exercising agency over reproductive choices, economic activity, and so on. But that, I think, links very much to, again, the points about methodology. I think your methodology is kind of an exemplar, really, of how to do this kind of work. It's a sort of, it's a huge exercise in the best kind of triangulation, really, because I think what you've done is you've gone through such a range of sources, you've picked from such a wide canvas that you've been able to build very plausible pathways, causative pathways even, between structure and agency and structure. And I think that is a really that is to me one of the biggest lessons from the book. Is this is a way to do political economy which blends the micro with the macro. And I just I can't resist this. Because I trained as an anthropologist. So I was just loving all the quotes from women and families and so on. So I'm just going to read one out very quickly, because I think this is my favorite. So a 41-year-old woman who had an IUD inserted without her husband's knowledge. She said, "I did not discuss it with my husband because he doesn't approve. He asked me why I did not get pregnant, and I replied, I don't think I will ever conceive again. You have become old. After that, my husband did not say anything. Sorry, did not ask any more." And well, that's not just bargaining with patriarchy, it's kind of actively turning the tropes of patriarchy against it. And the book is just full of wonderful examples like that, which again build the kind of picture that a number of the panelists were talking about. Aisha, you were particularly, I think, picking up on this in relation to Pakistan. It's almost, if you like, under the radar kind of what is going on, which is perhaps not being picked up. So I think I probably just want to end with just a comment which links together what a number of you have said about how does this relate to the wider South Asia picture and also possibly beyond. And the book did also leave me thinking about what is it that is more context specific about Bangladesh and what is more generalizable about the Bangladesh experience. And the question in my mind was, well, is Bangladesh always an outlier? And it's interesting how Bangladesh has particularly within development discourses, always comes up as an outlier in something, you know, and often a positive outlier. And in the book, you trace the particular form that path dependency has taken in Bangladesh and the particular type of classic patriarchy pitted against social orders that have a long history of flux. And again, others have picked up on this. What is it about the flexibility of Bangladesh that might make differences there? So in certain respects, it's a very particular path dependency, a very particular kind of trajectory. There's a fluidity about the social and political structures and the land relations that constantly seems to push against certain kinds of social hierarchies. And you also, of course, again, made me realize it's so obvious if you spent any time in Bangladesh that even the physical contours of the land are not stable. You know, they're also in flux as well, and that the topographical history is also part of the story of change. So I suppose it raises the question, which may be implicit in some of your analysis, is do these conditions make it easier to renegotiate, easier in inverted commas, to renegotiate patriarchy in Bangladesh? Or is it that we haven't done enough of this kind of political economy which links these dimensions together? And that, as a number of the panelists have commented on, you know, are we just missing some of this story? And this is the story that needs to come back into the picture. Have we not been paying enough attention? So I'll stop there and we can move on to discussion.
Okay, Naila, do you want to just respond quickly to the 2 points that Hilary made? We have some questions as well, but then we can also go around about, you know, have the other countries missed the chance to tell these stories? Yeah. Naila, your microphone.
Less about that and more about a question that I also asked myself a lot, is Bangladesh always going to be an outlier? Or does it have, are there lessons we can draw from the Bangladesh story? If there is any lesson at all, it is pay attention to your own context. You know, the people who made policies in Bangladesh came out of that context. You know, they weren't outsiders. The Zafrullah Chaudhrys, the Abids, the Yunus, all of these people, they knew what they were working with because they were not that far away from what they were working with. And I think if there is one possible generalizable story, it is pay attention to what is there in front of you and work with that. One other point that I thought, Aisha, you will have remembered it, but the international donors played a particular kind of role in that the aid they gave to Pakistan was tied to military aid, to the army. The aid they gave to Bangladesh, which was seen as this classic development disaster, was tied to development. So we didn't have external forces strengthening our military in the way that Pakistan did. But yes, and I think I would love to see stories from Pakistan and from India that move away from, the stories we keep hearing and do take. And I don't think enough is done. I don't think so, because I've kind of looked. Yeah.
Aisha, I had the feeling that you wanted to say something. You don't want to not at the moment. Urvashi, did you want to? There was the other point about the political economy narrative that Hillary made about what, are the other countries missing telling this kind of a story? Or any views, anyone? Otherwise, we can take the questions from the audience. Urvashi, do you want to go and say something?
Just briefly, I don't think that those kinds of stories are not being told from, say, a country like India. But I suspect that it's not, how should I say it without sounding horrible? I think perhaps they are not being told by that many academics, and they are largely being collected and told by activists. And perhaps, this is a terrible generalization to make, but there is some truth in it, as there is in most generalizations. And I think the merging of those stories might help us to get a better picture, but I don't know, I could be wrong. But it's not, I see those stories around me all the time. As a publisher, I see them around me all the time, but I don't know if they are actually being told in the kind of way that Naila has put them together.
Aisha, did you want to say anything about why you think such stories are not happening in Pakistan?
No, I wanted to comment on the stories, but from the perspective of who funds the research, because our research doesn't fund us to look at longitudinal qualitative data or even to collect it. And development research industry, of which many of us are a part, does not encourage the kind of in-depth, long-term qualitative studies that would allow us to not only collect life histories in a really meaningful way, but look at intergenerational change and have a historical perspective on developments. But I think that Naila's book really makes the case for doing that in a proper way across more than Bangladesh, but in any context.
Sajeda, I was going to ask you if you had something to say, and then we can take the questions. Some are for all of you, Naila, some are for you, of course. Did you just want to add to?
Just quickly that I think even in the other renditions of the Bangladesh paradox, we haven't quite seen this kind of political economy narrative. And there's almost a complete absence of gender in most of those, which I think makes this, for me, much more compelling, because not just because I'm a feminist, but because that allows you to have a certain institutional lens or certain social lens that you miss out a big part of the picture if you talk about macroeconomics, for instance, only.
Thank you. Okay, so let's take a few questions from members of the audience. The first one is for all of you. I think it is beyond just South Asia in the way in which it's framed. I will read it out exactly as it is written because I don't want to paraphrase someone else's question. How is Bangladesh's gender paradox reflective of a global gender paradox? Naila, do you want to start? Your microphone.
I'm going to leave my mic on. What is the global gender paradox?
It doesn't explain the question. I think it's
Maybe it can
are
come
there
back.
parallels or are there? I think that's what it means.
I'm stumped. Would anyone else like to try?
Anyone? Okay, I'll give everyone some time to think. Shall we get on to the next question? Naila, this is for you. What you describe is so similar to Pakistan, where feminists negotiate against money, military, and mullahs, but without the same gains. What prevents full gender equality in Bangladesh? What prevents full gender equality in Bangladesh?
I would say, first, it's hard to know what full gender equality would look like, right? I don't know what it would look like. One could ask what prevents a much more just, a gender just society to operate in Bangladesh? Because patriarchy is still there. There is still violence against women. There is still, they still face disapproval and censure when they do things outside the normal rules. A lot of these changes have happened at the local level and within the family. So I think we still have, even for women to be able to walk in public spaces and feel safe, would be going some way towards greater equality. What prevents it? We have a long history of this kind of a culture. And so what my book is about is the changes that have been made in spite of the kinds of barriers that women have had to face. So what prevents full gender equality, whatever that means, is the persistence of patriarchal norms and patriarchal practices. Men, at the local level, get very threatened by even some sign of progress. So a lot of the renegotiation that I'm talking about is actually to pretend that progress, nothing has changed. Everything is business as usual, but things are changing. People know they're changing. They don't have to talk about it. So the answer to what prevents a much more gender just society is that it evolved over centuries, and it's going to take quite a long time to get to a situation where both men and women feel comfortable to be friends and associates, and rather than relying on this continuing inequality. So I don't know if anyone else would like to answer that.
Anyone else?
There was something about Pakistan as well.
Aisha, there's a bit about Pakistan in this. I have to say, it doesn't mean you have to answer every question or every point on Pakistan. Not what I'm suggesting at all. Can I just make that very clear? But just in case you would want to say something, because I think there is a pertinent question here for everyone, including those of us who live in this part of the world, which is about, as Naila said at the very start, what is full gender equality? But the question about Pakistan, I'll read it out to you again, just as it is written. It says, what you describe is so similar to Pakistan, where feminists, not women, feminists negotiate against money, military, and mullahs, but without same gains. Was there something, would you like to say something about why there are no gains, or is the question?
Well, I think the gains that Naila is pointing to in her book have to do with the gains that have been made at the micro level in the lives of poor women who have managed to negotiate space, given new opportunities. But I just wanted to say one sentence, which I failed to say in my comments, which I think point to the pattern for future social change, which is that Naila's argument points to the material underpinnings of this change. And the material underpinnings have to do with a woman's ability to earn, whatever it may be, and therefore renegotiate her place within her natal and then her married home, and renegotiate her opportunities in life. And, that's, I think, a fundamental contribution here to how we think about change in Pakistan.
Anyone else?
Nilanjan, may I come in
Yeah,
here?
please do, Urvashi, please do.
Just a comment or a question to the questioner in some ways. My sense is that a question like that, I mean, equality is not the only thing we're talking about. No? Equality is a very important concept, and we're all striving towards it. But if you look at a country like India, for example, we are so deeply hierarchized on so many bases, fundamentally caste, also class, also gender, also location, also religion. So if we're talking about equality unproblematically, who does a Dalit woman want to be equal to? A Dalit man or a rich woman, a privileged woman, or what? So, I mean, I don't want to diss equality, but I just want to say that it's not the only answer. I don't know if that's the right way of putting it. I mean, we have to talk of equality plus plus. And so even if feminists in Pakistan became very equal, who are the feminists? Or even if feminists in India did, who are the feminists? A lot of them are people like me. There's a lot of women who are unequal to me. So what are we actually talking about here? Sorry, I just wanted to raise that.
Sure. Naila, did you want to say something, Hillary?
No.
Okay, Hillary.
Yes, I agree with with Naila and Urvashi and so on. Is what is it we are talking about here? And it has to be both. It seems to me contextualized, but also I think we've kind of gone a bit away from the equality language. I mean, for a long time, certainly, I work most successfully in the field of international health, and the language is equity. It's not equality. It's because that gives a dimension to it, which is a political dimension. Is what equity means fairness by a values standard that has to be negotiated. Is what is fair to people, and I think the other language which is really become more helpful in thinking about these issues globally is the language of intersectionality. Urvashi said equality plus plus, and this is gender plus plus. It's how does gender intersect with poverty, with race, with a whole lot of markers of disadvantage and discrimination, because you build a much more complex and nuanced picture that way of what is inequitable in society. So that's not an answer, but it's really just saying why I think we struggle with the language of equity is because we've moved to perhaps a different way of thinking, a different language for framing that. And as Urvashi said, what are we talking about? A poor rich or puller, a man, and a woman who's wealthy, doesn't have to go out to work, and so on. What's the comparator here? It's not a terribly meaningful kind of comparator to make. So I think that's why the language has changed.
Thank you. We have one last question, at least for the moment. Naila, this is for you. The economy took off in the 90s. How did this impact in expanding the choice set of women? And what did that create? Sorry, I'm going to read this again. How did this impact in expanding the choice set of women? And did that create a feedback loop back into the economy?
Yes, the economy took off in the early 1990s. The economy took off partly because population had begun to decline. So after a long time, the economic growth was rising faster than population growth. So that was one of the things that led to the economic growth rising. And that population decline, of course, is linked to what I'm talking about. I think it had very important effects and feedback effects, because with the economy expanding, the kind of economic choices and opportunities that were made available for both men and women is a part of the story. And the state could also afford to fund social protection measures, girls' schooling, etc., all of which expanded the possibilities available to women. So I think economic growth and the progressive side of the gender paradox did go hand in hand. But what we also saw, and what we've seen in a lot of the world, is this was a highly unequal growth. So, the fact that Bangladesh still relies so much on international migration, mainly men, but also many, many women, it's because there are not enough jobs in the local economy. And we are seeing the story of where some of that growth has gone, and it's gone into corruption, it's gone into all kinds of, illicit places. So that's the other side of the Bangladesh paradox, that it took place first in conditions of extreme poverty, and then with growing prosperity in conditions of extreme inequality, highly unequal, far more unequal than Bangladesh has ever been. So opportunities came, the export government sector is part of that story, women being able to, start up their own enterprises in the countryside. All of that is a part of the growth story. But what we mustn't lose sight of is the inequality story, because the inequality story is what feeds into disaffection. And, people see enormous wealth, and they see that some of that wealth is not coming down to poorer people. So I think it's a slightly complicated story, the growth story, because of the high levels of inequality it came with.
Okay, thank you. Was anyone else going to say something about the economy, equality, inequality? No? Okay. Shall we have about 10-ish minutes. Naila, would you like to say something by way of closing remarks? Yeah, shall we start with you?
Sure. I think it's not possible to have this conversation at this time without talking about what's happened in Bangladesh. And, very fortunately, one of my external reviewers said to me about the final chapter, are you not going to ask the question, how sustainable is the progress that Bangladesh has made? And so actually, that final chapter, which was written before the July rising, I was thinking about it. And I was thinking all the things that made the Bangladesh paradox a paradox had not been fixed, okay? So, we've got out of extreme abysmal poverty, but as I've just pointed out, it's been a very unequal pathway to growth, with vast sections of people still going hungry, still not getting enough to eat. Governance has not been fixed. We had a period in the 1990s where we had alternate parties winning elections, and it looks very healthy from the outside. But the mindset was a very zero-sum one. The moment a party lost, they spend their time in opposition trying to bring the other party down, rather than trying to set up a healthy democracy or put forward good critiques of what the government was doing. And of course, that has deteriorated considerably, particularly since the last Awami League government got into power in 2007. And we've seen a lot of disappearances. We've seen, the exercise of quite an autocratic state. But I think the final thing that, the final part of the paradox, which is this rising Islamic orthodoxy being brought to us from Middle Eastern money, finding, quite a receptive audience among sections of society. One chapter of the book deals with why these parties don't win elections in Bangladesh. And it deals with why, despite the fact that the Jamaat-e-Islam and others had a full frontal attack on NGOs that worked with women, on the various attempts to empower women through, various opportunities, they didn't actually manage to take over. What I fear now is the political parties that paid lip service to some kind of secularism are beginning to disappear. And all that's left standing are people who have a very single-minded definition of Islam. And I use a phrase in the book about we all have to find our own pathways to personhood. We all have to find our own pathways to God. And what I fear is that we may be taken over by people who will only allow one pathway to God. And that will not be good for women. It will not be good for minorities. So we have to see, there's an interim government. It's doing what it can. But the future is very, very uncertain. And all the gains that we have made, that poor people have made, that women have made, and some of the gains that minorities have also made, though, it's been through a very hard and armed struggle. We have to ask, how sustainable will that be? Not for the reasons that other people were asking about growth, etc., but how sustainable will it be in the kind of polity that is going to emerge in the next year or so? And we'll have to see. We'll have to see. But it troubles me that those parties that paid some lip service to tolerance and secularism and pluralism in belief systems have been hit very badly in this process. One has, scored its own goals, and the other, the BNP was decimated by the Awami League's years in power. So I don't know who will come to the forefront, and I would be extremely sad if all that the sacrifices that were made to bring down the last government because of where it had got were made in vain, and that the victory was claimed by people who are not particularly tolerant of others.
Sajeda, did you want to say anything? Looking ahead.
I think one thing that Naila mentions in her book as a caveat, which may be part of this chasm, is Bangladesh is urbanizing in very dramatic ways. And a lot of what this book refers to is a rural phenomena. And perhaps it is worth paying attention to those processes of what's happening in urban areas, what's happening to the disaffected youth in urban areas. This movement was in large part quite urban, as many movements are. So maybe that takes a different lens, but it's an important one.
Aisha, did you want to say anything about what Naila said towards the end just now about the fragility of positive development in the context of lessening pluralistic polity?
Yeah, during the course of the whole panel discussion today, I was thinking about Afghanistan because the closure of opportunities for women in terms of education and employment is having real impacts on the culture of families and the discourses around women's mobility and girls' opportunities, even their subordination and women's retreat from decision-making within the home. UN Women has done a survey, and there are other organizations that are beginning to pick up on this. And I think that just kind of reflects the same story back to us, but what could happen in terms of reversal of gains when you shut down opportunities in terms of education and employment specifically. So the material underpinnings of social change get removed, and how quickly the house of cards collapses without that. So you're seeing men, since the new morality law, beginning to then enforce their oppression of women within the home with a new zeal. So what does that tell us about how quickly patriarchy can rebound given the opportunity? So that's just something that I was thinking while I was listening to everyone's comments.
Thank you. Urvashi, did you want to add anything?
Thanks, Nilanjan. I wanted to echo Naila's concern about, the reversal of gains, the losses that seem so real and tangible on the horizon now because of the way things have shaped up. And also really what Aisha was saying about what's happened in Afghanistan. We're a very different country, but the dangers are all too real, even here in many ways. So it's a sobering thought, really, but there's also, I don't want to end on that note of despair almost, because I think one of the things that Naila's book does so well is to show that while patriarchy and patriarchies find so many ways to fulfill their nefarious and evil agenda, even the poorest of women find some way or the other to counter that. And I think that saluting that battle for us is equally important. So just that.
Hilary, did you want to say something?
I'll just make one.
You've turned off the microphone.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah.
Sorry. Yes, I suppose I can't comment on Bangladesh. I did attend a seminar yesterday where two people who've been looking closely at and collecting information on what's been happening in Bangladesh spoke. And what I will say from that is they both gave to me a surprisingly upbeat assessment of the situation, in the sense that they felt that there's been quite a lot of misinformation, which has been all-round misinformation, and part of what they're doing is which I think is probably the most important thing that could be done at this stage in terms of what academics do, is collecting as much information as they possibly could. So they've been doing a lot of vox pops and just trying to test the temperature to try and find out what's going on in different areas. And the point they made was it's very diverse across the country. It's diverse in terms of urban versus rural. It's diverse in different rural areas, and different issues are coming up. So I came away with feeling some optimism that there are good things happening as well. I suppose my reflection generally is that no battles for social justice are ever won completely, wherever we are. It's just as true where I'm sitting in Britain. When I look across Europe at some of the things that have, the trends and tendencies that we've seen in the last few years, it's always a fight, but it's a political fight, and we have to keep going on that fight, really. The last thing I want to say is to all the viewers and listeners on YouTube, please read Naila's book. It's there, it's free, and it's as all the panelists have said, it's an absolutely wonderful read. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hilary. Yes, please do read Naila's book. We've pasted the link here in the chat box. It's free to download. It's open access. You can visit the LSE Press website and download it from there. I did also want to take this chance. I usually don't do it, but Aisha provided me with the perfect segue, which is our event next week is on how men and women in Afghanistan are living with Taliban laws. and it's called Taliban. It's called Afghanistan Living with Taliban Laws, and we have invited people who are currently living inside Afghanistan, as well as those who have had to leave recently or those who left in 2021, to exactly talk about. And one of the most important aspects that we wanted to include in the event next week is the impact that it has on men, whether because of the impact the laws have on their women relatives, or whether they have the impact it actually has on men themselves in terms of, their movements and where they can go and who they can move around with in public. But that's next week. If you would like to sign up, please go to our website and sign up from there. It remains for me to thank everyone. And I've been doing these events for several years now, decades actually. But I say this at the end of every weekly event that I do, that if there's one good thing that came out of the pandemic, it's that we all became Zoom savvy. And that has allowed us to convene these panel discussions. But it is equally true, and I say this to each of you individually, Urvashi Butalia, Sajeda Amin, Aisha Khan, and Hilary Standing, and I will thank Naila separately, that had it not been for the generosity of your time and your expertise, we cannot have these discussions if you don't give us this time and this expertise. So we're very grateful. Thank you very much. Naila, thank you very much for writing the book, for agreeing to participate in this discussion. And I want to thank LSE Press, who have been very supportive with this and with whom we have done this event in collaboration. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, Nilanjan. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay,